props. You got to have props for your sermon so that you can have them up here and people can wonder, what is he going to do with those the entire time? It keeps you alert. It keeps you awake. Especially on the back end of this sermon series, we've been exploring not necessarily Jude, the book, but just the idea of Jude that's communicated there in that third verse, talking about the faith that has been once and for all entrusted to the saints. Jude writes that because he knows that there's going to come a time whenever there are no longer those that are in the faith that are going to be in the faith. In fact, Jude has sort of lived to see that time where Christians are starting to believe some things that aren't necessarily, the word would be orthodoxy, aren't necessarily traditional faith. But Jude also writes this because he knows that there are going to be those outside of the faith, outside of the meetings that are going to come in and going to challenge the teachings that were once entrusted. And so Jude just says, contend for the faith. This is a part one of a two-part series. This morning what we're going to do is we're going to look at certain problems that the early church encountered. And then we'll also just look at certain problems that we encounter today. Next Sunday we're going to determine what the solutions were for the early church in these problems, and then also determine what the solutions are for us in our problems. One of the problems that the early church dealt with, among many, we'll look at three this morning. One of the problems was this group called the Judaizers. We get a first glimpse of the issue with certain Jewish Christians actually criticizing Peter for eating with uncircumcised men, eating with Gentiles. This was a big no-no. And Peter, the Jew, starts eating with the Gentiles, and all of a sudden he's being criticized for it. Later in the book of Acts chapter 15, we have what is called the Jerusalem Council, where this problem reaches a head, and all of these Jews are saying, wait a second, these Gentiles, if they want to follow Jesus, they need to be like Jews. They need to follow the law. And so the apostles, they're gathered together, and they determine what's going on. In fact, they required it for salvation. Unless you are circumcised, according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This is what these uncircumcised Jewish Christians were saying about these Gentile converts coming into the Christian faith. The whole book of Hebrews, the context seems to imply that there are a group of Christians who are Jewish but no longer observing the law, but they're thinking about going back to observing the law. And so the author of Hebrews writes and exhorts them, challenges them to not do that. Peter at one point seemed to even have a struggle with the pressure from the Judaizers. Paul actually rebukes him. Looking at Galatians, Paul says, before certain men came from James, Peter, this is the he, Peter used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter in front of them all, you are a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? And the Greek word, where we get our English word Judaizers, is used right here, the Jewish customs. That is the idea. That's the only place it's used in the Bible. It's coined by Paul, Judaizers. And so this issue was actually settled by apostolic authority. Those believers who were with Jesus, the apostles, the 12 with him from the time of his beginning of his ministry until his ascension, they had what we call apostolic authority. So they were able to make this decree to say, no, this is what the Gentiles are to do. They're not to observe the law. But with their absence in the world, other problems creeped in, and this is where our second problem comes from. It was something called Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a generic label given to a wide variety of Christian teachers in schools that existed on the fringes of the early church and became a major problem for Christian leaders in the 2nd century. It comes from the word gnosis, which means knowledge. And so these Gnostics, this was likely a problem prior to the end of all of the apostles. Because in our Bibles, it does seem to, some of the books that are written seem to address some of the problems that the Gnostics promoted. For instance, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, as well as Colossians, 1 John, and even Jude, seem to be written with some of these Gnostic ideas in mind. And so the Gnostics, they blended into Christian services really well because they used the same language as Christians did. They celebrated the same elements, the Lord's Supper. They did very similar things. Have you ever tried to have a conversation with a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon and you're saying the same things? Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Son of God. Jesus is Christ. But in reality, they mean something completely different. This is with the Gnostics. They were able to come into church services, use the same language, worship in the same style, but in their minds, they were worshiping correctly because they had the real truth. They had that gnosis, this special knowledge that was communicated from Jesus to the apostles, that is then directly communicated from the apostles to them. See, they were claiming apostolic authority. And this was a problem. Their beliefs varied among certain teachers, between certain groups, because basically, not only did they borrow from other religions, but these teachers could make up their own things. And so the main thing that all of their teachings revolved around was having this special wisdom that nobody else had. And this is ultimately what saved them. But along with the special knowledge, they generally had certain teachings in common. They believed, imagine in your mind kind of a triangle. They had multiple levels of gods. The God at the highest, at the peak point of the triangle, was an unknowable, impersonal, distant God. He did not create. He has no involvement with the creation. In fact, they believed that there was this lesser God down here, this evil God that created the world, created you and I, and so they saw that the material world, especially flesh, was evil. And they saw the purpose for us was to be set free from this evil imprisonment we call flesh. Because in their minds, what they said was our souls, what was inside of us, was a spark of God, a piece of God. And that piece of God needed to be set free. The only way that spark from God could be set free was by possessing this special knowledge, this gnosis. And they said that that's why Jesus came. He came to show us the truth, to show us the way, but not in the way that John 14:6 says. Not in the way that you and I define the way and the truth and the life. They believed that Jesus was a God that came down, that he had nothing to do with his flesh, because again, flesh is evil, that Jesus came down to reveal to them the truth. And then he disappeared. They actually called him their heavenly Redeemer. Very similar language, is it not? But it doesn't mean the same. Gnostics liked to differentiate between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. They claimed that the God of the Old Testament was all about an eye for an eye. He was a mean bully kind of a guy. And then the God of the New Testament, the Father. So the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh. The God of the New Testament, the Father. Oh man, that God of the New Testament, the Father, He was all about love your neighbor. He was all about love, whereas this other God in the Old Testament, He was hateful and vengeful. He was mean. And so they believed that Jesus was sent by the Father to save us from this mean God of the Hebrews. And this teaching actually kind of lends to our third problem. It was a guy named Marcion, or Marcion. You can say it either way. But Marcion took the idea of unhitching from the Old Testament to the whole new level. I mean, he took that cart that the Old Testament was on, he set it on fire, he kicked it over a cliff, and then he threw dynamite on top of it. The dude hated, he just didn't see any connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because again, he got hung up on this idea of Yahweh being a different God from the Father. He saw that Yahweh was vengeful and wrathful, mean. But then the Father, whom again, very similar to the Gnostics, believed that Jesus came to reveal to us. Marcion drew up, you might call it a first canon of Scripture. What he did was he drew up Scripture that we find in our New Testaments, and he said these books are authoritative for Christians. And he took the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and he crinkled it all up and he threw it out. He took 3 of the 4 Gospels, crinkled them up, threw them out, only keeping Luke, because Luke was written by a Gentile. He also then took 10 of Paul's letters, edited them in any place that might have showed favoritism or continuation from the Old to the New. He edited them, and he said, these are scriptures that are authoritative for Christians. Now, if you glance at our Bibles, obviously we don't do that. But Marcion was kind of one of the first guys to set pen to paper and say these books are authoritative. Not only did he reject the Old Testament and the God therein, but he also rejected the idea that Jesus was actually human. He only believed that Jesus was only God and that there was no humanity in Him. Now this is a problem because if Jesus was not human, He was not a perfect or adequate sacrifice. Now these ideas, the Judaizers, Gnosticism, the teachings of Marcion, they were very prevalent. And maybe you're looking at this list and you're wondering, I don't really hear much about those anymore. But they're creeping back into society. There's a movement that seems to be gaining some steam. It's called the Hebraic Roots Movement. And essentially what it says is, in order to be a Christian, in order to follow Jesus, you have to follow the law. To me it sounds very similar to the Judaizers. And I'm interested. If you've encountered any of this, let me know. I'd love to talk with you about it. Gnosticism is so relevant today, it just takes on a different name, various names, but one of the main names that you might find if you go to the bookstore and go to the spirituality section, you'll find this section called New Age. New Age is regurgitated Gnosticism. It's interesting. I one time was going through a church library, not this church, and I'm just looking through the books. And I find this weird book. It was one of Oprah's best-selling, one of Oprah's book club lists, which I don't know how you feel about Oprah, but Oprah is a modern-day New Age Gnostic prophet, you might say, teacher. But this book, I'm looking at it and I go, this is strange. It was by a man named Eckhart Tolle. And the title of it was A New Earth, Awakening Your Soul, or something of that nature. Awakening to your life's purpose. I got to reading through that, and holy cow, this is not Christian reading. It's all about, essentially, that you are a God, And in order to release your goddess, or godness, the God that was within you, easy for you to say, right? In order to release this God, you have to have this certain knowledge. The Da Vinci Code, I don't know if you read Dan Brown's book or watched the movie, entertaining, good fiction, but within that there are some ideas that promote the Gnosticism, just the idea that there were lost books of the Bible. Have you ever heard about those? Those are the Gnostic books. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip. These books that were written by Gnostic teachers, but in order to give them an air of authority, they attach an important name on them and say, look at this. Those were all found, I think, in the 1960s, a big library near Egypt, 1940s. Gnosticism is still relevant. And then Marcion's ideas, the idea that God in the Old Testament is angry and mean, that is being promoted in a huge way by evangelist, atheist, Richard Dawkins. Now I'm about to quote something to you, and I'm going to be honest, I can't pronounce some of these words. Now, maybe you can. So I'm just, instead of trying to pronounce them, I'm just going to tell you what they mean. Here's what Richard Dawkins, atheist, says. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak. A vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser. A person who does not like women. He's homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, which is the act of deliberately killing your own child. Pestilential. He's a megalomaniac. Sadomasochistic. He enjoys self-pain and the pain of others. And he is a capriciously malevolent bully. That is, he's subject to certain mood changes. This is the teaching of Marcion, repackaged in big words for our modern day. And I'll be honest, this is something that Christians, we all should be able to sit down with somebody who thinks these things and be like, hey, I get why you're saying this. Let's talk about these stories. Let's talk about these scriptures within context, and let me show you how the God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. Now here's where I'm going with all of this. We want to believe that we live in Mayberry. We want to believe that Iberia is a small, rural community, that these crazy ideas, that they're not going to infiltrate. We're going to keep these things out, and we're going to be free of all of these other options of worship and contending philosophies. And maybe we are. Maybe Iberia is safe. But I'm going to tell you something. You probably already know this. Everybody sitting in these pews, in a few years, they won't be sitting in these pews. Because they're going to graduate high school, and they're going to go to college, they're going to start a job, or as I tell the kids, they're going to go to the real world, and these ideas are going to confront them, especially if they go to a secular campus. They won't be there a year. I'm sure they won't even be there 6 months before some of these ideas are going to come at them. And obviously this isn't some kind of scare tactics, it's just reality. But here's the thing, I don't think that we're safe. I don't think our school is safe from these sorts of philosophies, because we live in a time now where instant access to all of the information in the world can be found at the click of a button on these supercomputers that we carry around in our pockets. And so if we're not equipped, if we're not to where we can talk about these things, especially for our children's sakes, our grandchildren, we'll be in trouble. They'll be in trouble. And so that's why Jude's letter, Contending for the Faith, is still relevant for us today. And so what problems confront us today? And we're just going to go through these really fast. I'm going to literally throw them out at you. First off, we live in a fallen world. Pay attention. We live, that's a warning for everybody. We live in a fallen world. And I think people all over the world feel this. I think they recognize it. I think that within the back of their minds, they feel like they're not as they should be. And so what do? What do we all do? We try to work off our salvation. We create a religion. And I think this explains why there are religions all over the world, because everyone feels and understands that they're not as they ought to be. That there is something or someone that we need to be reconciled to. And so we have this innate burden, this natural burden that we feel that we have to work off our salvation. Now, I also think that this is why atheists or anybody really who decides, I'm not going to believe in God, I'm not going to go through all of this stuff, I think that's why they say, I just felt a loosening of pressure. Because they stop feeling the guilt, they stop dealing with that, they stop trying to work off their salvation, and they just say, hey, there's nothing. Obviously, that's not true. But we live in a fallen world where people are convinced that salvation is either unattainable or else just non-existent. So the question for you, dear Christian, is what hope are you offering to people who are not Christians? We live in a fallen world. Good catch. Not only do we live in a fallen world, we live in a post-Christian world. Many, at least in America, have seen Christianity at work, either in their lives or in the lives of somebody else, and they have deemed it as failure or insignificant or not anything that can change them. It doesn't work for them, and so they just reject it. No doubt, I'm going to guess anybody over the age of 16 living in Iberia could tell us a story about Jesus, not because they believe it, but because they've heard the old story, and it's just not for them. Because we live in America is sort of at one time maybe was Christian, it's kind of a post-Christian world now that we live in. We've been Christian for so long that people have seen it, so they either say no thank you, or else they just say it's not for me. So finally, Christian, not finally yet, but what reasons to believe are you giving people who are not Christians? So we live in a fallen world. We live in a post-truth or post-Christian world. And finally, we live in a post-truth world. And I'm not talking about that hashtag fake news stuff, right? Everybody, hashtag, there you go. Hashtag fake news, not what a post-truth world is. We live in a world that not only finds the words of Pilate silly, what is truth, that question that Pilate asked Jesus, but we live in a time whenever people become offended whenever you say that there is something as absolute truth. That there is some kind of truth that exists in all of the world, and it is a true for everyone. Our world is fading away from objective facts and being governed by absolute truth. Our climate today is ruled by subjectivism, relativism, and feelings. And so what sort of truth are you living out around those that are not Christians? So we live in a fallen world. We live in a post-Christian world. We live in a post-truth world. In light of all of this, in light of what the church once dealt with, Judaizers, Gnosticism, the teachings of Marcion, and many other crazy things, maybe those aren't the pressing issues for us today, but I believe these are. And so our example of contending for the faith will be taught to those who watch us. It is imperative that as Christians we're able to deal with these issues. And we'll talk about that next Sunday. But again, your example of contending for the faith will be shown to the generations following you, or dare I say your lack of example for contending for the faith will be taught to those who watch you. So as we close, just repeat these final questions. How are you contending for the faith that was once and all for all entrusted to the saints? Are you offering hope to the hopeless? Are you giving people reasons to believe? Are you showing them the truth? What are you doing with your testimony? Consider this as Jenny comes up, as anyone else comes up. All three of these questions, they point to one thing. They point to one person. They point to Jesus. Jesus gives hope to the hopeless. He gives reasons to believe for those who can't believe. He is the truth. So Jude's simple statement contend for the faith that was once and for all entrusted to the saints is relevant for us today because the generations coming behind us depend upon us to show them how to contend for the faith. And so I'm going to ask you to stand. I'm going to be up here. I'm going to be worshiping. But if you need anything, if you want prayer, we've got water in the baptistry. But if you need anything from me, come up, tap me on the shoulder, and we'll talk, we'll pray, and then we'll go from there.